Welcome to the Perkins Allocation Formula and Budget Development webinar. Perkins basic funding for each secondary and post-secondary eligible recipient is determined by a formula outlined in Perkins 5 legislation. The allocation formulas can be found in Section 131 for secondary and Section 132 for post-secondary. The definition of eligible recipient can be found in Section 3 of Perkins 5 legislation. You can use this link to access the full text. Section 112 of Perkins 5 legislation outlines the requirements for state-level Perkins funding. Not less than 85% of the state's allocation must be made available to secondary and post-secondary eligible recipients. This amount becomes the Perkins Basic Grant. The state can set aside up to 10% of its total allocation to Perkins leadership. Of this amount, there are several set-asides or earmarking requirements. 2% must be made available to serve its individuals in state institutions like correctional or juvenile justice facilities and educational institutions that serve individuals with disabilities. Between $60,000 and $150,000 must be set aside for services that prepare individuals for non-traditional fields. An amount shall be made available for the recruitment of special populations to enroll in CTE programs, which shall be not less than the lesser of an amount equal to 0.1% or $50,000. Leadership funding is also used to support CTFOs and other grant opportunities like the Perkins Assessment Grant. An amount equal to not more than 5% or $250,000, whichever is greater, is allowed for Perkins administration. The state is required to match this amount. The Perkins Reserve Grant is an optional set-aside that falls under the same section of the budget as Perkins Basic funding. Like Perkins Basic, these funds are only available to secondary and post-secondary eligible recipients, otherwise known as CTE districts. Indiana Code 20-20-38-12 requires that at least 60% of Perkins Basic funding be made available to our secondary eligible recipients. In March or April, Octay sends out a memo outlining the total Perkins allocation for each state for the upcoming grant period. Octay is the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education at the federal level. The memo also includes instructions for determining the amounts to be distributed to our secondary and post-secondary eligible recipients. Octay provides a link to the SAPE data used to calculate the allocation for each CTE district. We are required to use this Census Bureau data, which is from a preceding fiscal year. For the 22-23 grant cycle, the data was from 2020. The distribution formula for secondary eligible recipients is outlined in Section 131. We'll talk more about this when we look at the actual data, but you can see from the legislation that it is a 30-70 split. I used the link provided by Octay to access the SAVE data in a spreadsheet. I filtered the data by Indiana's postal code or FIPS code. The data included is the total population for the state, the number of students 5 to 17 years old, and 5 to 17-year-olds living in poverty. The distribution formula for secondary eligible recipients is outlined in Section 132. As you can see, this data is based on Pell Grant recipiency. The easiest way to plan for a 2-year budget when the allocation changes from year 1 to year 2 is to use a percentage-based calculation. Your allocation is impacted by several factors, including the amount we receive from the feds and the number of students typically, the greatest impact is the number of students living in poverty. If that amount goes down, your allocation will likely drop. Another reason that an allocation might be less than previous year is that you have experienced a separation. One of your school corporations has left your CT district. And we'll talk more about that as well. The budget categories that you will need to use when you prepare your budget are as follows. Administration, which is capped at 5% of the total award, and depending on your school corporation or your CT district rules or your fiscal agent rules, administration can be direct and or direct indirect charges. So it could be either of those, direct or indirect. We can talk more about that if you have any questions about administration and how that is charged. Only certain positions are allocable to Perkins through Section 135, and those would be charged to personnel. Depending on your local policies, stipends might be personnel or fringe benefits, or they might be contractual services. Talk to your business office or business manager to be sure. Your business manager can give you a specific percentage to use for fringe benefits, but I typically estimate fringe as 30% of the personnel category. So if I charge $10,000 to personnel, I'm going to allocate about $3,000 to fringe. Travel is limited to staff travel only. Please review your GAN for more specific information. Student bus transportation for field trips or CTSO events, other types of bus transportation for all students would be charged to contractual services. The contractual services category covers a wide variety of expenditures, including registration fees, MOUs, service agreements, other forms of contracts, annual software licenses, stipends, and much more. Assets over the federal threshold of $5,000 per item are considered equipment. Pre-approval is required for any equipment purchase, whether it's general purpose or program specific. All of those types of purchases require a pair form, and they would also need to be tracked. Any asset under the federal threshold of $5,000 per item is considered a material asset. Program-specific materials do not require pre-approval, but general purpose assets of any cost do require pre-approval through the pair form. You have the option, of course, of tracking materials. Some material assets could easily walk away, or there's something that you do want to keep a close eye on, you can track those as well. It's not a requirement. 2 CFR 200, the Code of Federal Regulations, Uniform Grant Guidance, otherwise known as the UG, is the overarching guidance that we use for Perkins. And this determines whether an expenditure is allowable. Allocability is mainly determined through Section 135 of Perkins 5 legislation because that is specific to that grant. But we have to follow all of these rules as well. Subpart E is the general provisions for selected items of cost, and you can click on the link here to access that text. It's rather extensive. Much of that information is included in your grant award notification on those pages that cover allowability, allocability, and disallowed expenses. Equipment information can be found in 313 and 439, and materials information is contained in 453. Please reach out to me if you have any questions related to grant administration, allowability or allocability, fiscal compliance, and fiscal monitoring. You can use this information to reach out to me throughout the week. I can usually be reached on my work cell phone, but email is often the best option if you are seeking official guidance. Written guidance is able to be saved. It's easier to transmit if you need it to share that information or you need to save information for an audit. Please reach out to me with questions. I'm going to transition away from the PowerPoint into the data set now. So the information on your screen at this point, I want to preface this part of the presentation. This is authentic data. I pulled this information for the upcoming grant period or grant cycle, fiscal year. So this is the information that will be used to determine your actual allocation for the new grant cycle. I get the information from the Save Data link, and that spreadsheet actually contains the data for every school corporation in the country. Um, every single state is covered in here. So I take it and I filter, I sort um, using the filter feature. I can't seem to click on any of these in here, but there's a filter there that allowed me to sort it by Indiana. I could use either one of these columns for that. Column C is the school corporation number, the federal identifier for each school corporation. You may or may not be aware of these numbers. We used to use the number for the fiscal agent on the reimbursement request form, but it really didn't apply to anything we needed from the state level for processing reimbursement. So I took that off and added the vendor ID, which the state actually does need to process your reimbursement request. But this number is matched to a school corporation in column D. Um, because the data is a year or two older than the actual year we're working in, if there have been name changes, separations, or conjoining of districts, school corporations, then that information will not likely be on here. I will have to update it to make sure that it's accurate for what we need for the coming year. But because the data is old, that information isn't captured when I pull the data. The other information that is included is the estimated total population for the state by school corporation, the estimated population of 5 to 17-year-olds in each corporation. And then again, that same pool is then, it becomes more specific because we're looking at those 5 to 17-year-olds living in poverty. So I take all of that information and I put it in another spreadsheet so that I have the raw data in one and I have just our data in the other. And I add the column or CTE district. And this is just the secondary formula. So post-secondary, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But I take each of the CTE districts that we have, I assign it to the relevant school corporation. Um, we have several different types here. We have co-ops, we have career centers, we have standalones like East Chicago or Gary or IPS. Um, so I take that and I look at all of that information. I add other columns like the 30% column and the 70% column. These are the numbers that I use in my formulas. The 30% relates to the total number of students in column G, and the 70% one here is the total number of students in column I. And we use that to create the formula that then gets turned into dollar amounts based on 30% and 70% of the total award. So I take that information and I add it together for each school corporation. And I like to look at it, and really this is the best way to do the formula, is to look at it by school corporation, um, so that we know essentially how much each of those school corporations is bringing to the table. Some CT directors like to look at that information, even if they're not assigning a dollar amount to each of those school corporations or giving that money out to the school corporations that are part of the consortium. It's sometimes nice to know, where that is. So you can use that information. I'm happy to send it out once I have the real allocation so that you can see those percentages and the amounts and see how that might be useful to you. Um, so we look at that information and then I start doing some checks on the work that I've done so far. And I check to make sure that everything adds up. The first check that I do is on just the raw data to make sure that when I compress it into a CT district, it makes sense, right? The next check I do is for the dollar amounts that are associated with each district, and this will eventually become your allocation once I look at the different rounding options available. And this one, I did two different rounding rules. I did rounding regular, which rounds up and down individually. And then I did a round down, which actually worked out the best. It matched up with the total budget exactly. So that was very helpful. I like that process. But if we did go with this one, what we would do would be to add $1 to each of the two lowest recipients. So likely 51 would receive $25,188 instead of $187. Not a huge impact, but every dollar counts, I guess. So when we make that determination, then that will become the amount that will drive your new budget. We'll get that added, and I'll talk to you in a few minutes about how we can take those numbers and easily rework our budget from one year to the next. And again, I don't want to get anyone's hopes up or dash anyone's hopes when we are looking at this information, because this is just a preliminary. I used a made up total allocation. I just selected a number that I thought seemed reasonable, and hopeful, of course, that we will get a larger allocation from the feds this year. So I just took that information and broke it out. Um, when we look at this information too, if you scroll down, you can see all of the different school corporations that we have in the state and all of the CT districts. We have a new district coming up this fiscal year, and it will be district number 52. That's the Pursuit Institute. And I've also had some questions about what happens if a school corporation decides to separate, either to form their own school CTE district or if they want to join a different CTE district. And we can talk about that more in just a few minutes. Before we hop to the mock budget, I want to take a look at this part of the spreadsheet. I'm in the middle of reworking this one. I entered some new data, so I don't have an exact picture here. As you can see, the fact doesn't check here. But if you look at this, the main point to consider here is that we have Pell Grant recipient data only. This is the only information that we base it off of. We take the Pell Grant students from each of the campuses. We compare that to the total enrollment that we have here. It becomes a percentage, which then becomes a dollar amount. So, um, as you can see, it doesn't add up at the bottom. So again, I have not finished with this one, but it is a work in progress. We don't have the allocation from the feds anyway, so it's not going to be accurate. I like to do a mock budget or to share this type of information. This is how I calculate our total state budget from year to year using percentages and basing it off that. Again, it's just a baseline. There are actually several different ways that you can develop your budget. The least of which, of course, is just going to be throwing some numbers out there and hoping that they stick or that they add up. But there are some better ways to do it. So I've made up a district here, and this information is based on one of the actual eligible recipients or CT districts. But I did change the numbers. So I've made up a CT district number. The federal IDs are all made up. The school corporation names are, of course, all made up. But the data itself is real and the calculations are real. So um, hopefully that will give us a good picture of what we're doing. So I took this information from all of the school corporations. I looked at the total allocation for the year and I plugged that into this box, the one that says 22, 23, 20, 24. That one. So I entered that number, and this will actually work with the formula that's built in. And you will all have a blank version of this once I double check the calculations are calculating correctly. In this column, column D, I've highlighted it in pink. This number is the current year that we're in right now. Let's say this is your grant award that you received was $115,400. Okay. So you take your most recent budget mod and you look at that, your most up-to-date reimbursement request form, not the amount that you entered in last year's grant application, because we already know that if you've changed your budget, those numbers no longer apply. They're not going to be as useful to you as the actual numbers. Um, so you just start entering those in as they appear in your reimbursement request form. You may have personnel and fringe benefits in there. I can tell you this is the most often budget mod reason this year beyond shuffling some dollars in equipment and materials. Personnel and fringe were miscalculated in several instances and had to be changed. So keep that in mind when you're planning. We'll talk more about that if we need to, but I covered that in the PowerPoint section. Is that you need to make sure that you're calculating those amounts correctly. We want to have as accurate a picture as possible. So again, you just enter those amounts in. The formulas that are built in will calculate your percentage of total, and then it will sort of, if you've entered this number into cell F8, it will automatically calculate the upcoming budget cycle amount. So then I've taken it and it will round it for you. You just need to double check that your administration rounding didn't go put you over your 5% cap. Okay, so if it did round it up, you'll have to reduce it um, back to the total of 5%. Please round everything though to the nearest whole dollar. Even if you have to round down on administration, you can round up somewhere else in the grant. Okay, this is the only one that's fully restricted. So it calculated it for me, and hopefully the formulas will work and do that for you as well. This is the easiest way to calculate from one fiscal year to the next when you know that your allocation will likely change. Obviously, we can't really plan for outliers in a lot of ways, but and this is the best method, obviously, if you are not really making substantial changes to the activities in your grant. Okay, so if you do decide that you want to make some major changes to your grant application this year, then we can talk about some other ways that you can come up with a budget and do it by percentages. That will then make it easy to plug in. You could use something inauthentic over here in terms of the amount for each of the categories. So that might help you draft that. The other one is based on an assigned percentage. So you don't really need last year's unless you just want it for reference, in which case I would fill out this top section and then come down to the bottom and think, okay, well, last year I used 2%, but I know I have to pay for the CLNA coming up and I want to use administrative dollars for that. So you might want to increase the amount that you put towards administration this year so that you can cover your CLNA costs. Same goes for, maybe the travel. You know that there are some conferences coming up in the next year, and you really want to be able to provide a lot more PD. That is one way to go. Or you know that PD is more expensive than you've imagined that it would be in the past. Flights have gone up, hotels, depending on where the conference is, can be very expensive. So you might want to pad those expenses a little bit. Um, Again, with personnel and fringe, I would talk to your business officer or your business manager to make sure that you're getting a clear picture of how much you actually spend in personnel and fringe or what you will likely spend and plan accordingly for that. I use 3 to 3.5% in my calculation. I put in 3.5 here because I wanted to pad for that change in health insurance and all of those fringe benefit changes that could happen in January of the fiscal year. Remember, we run on a fiscal year, the federal fiscal year, which is July to June, as opposed to a calendar year, which most health insurance is calendar year. So you take those amounts and you enter your percentage total into this column, how much you want to spend for each one, or this is, again, it's just an approximation, and it will give you the amount that you would need to put in each of those categories. Some people do plan their activities this way. Some states restrict. So if you were restricted in your state by 10% for personnel, then you could just go ahead and put that in and know that you were restricted to that amount. We don't have those kind of restrictions except in administration. But that is something that you might be restricting more at a local level. Like you determine as the CT director, okay, I really want to move away from personnel because I'm not comfortable supporting people with a federal grant that could change if a CT district were to experience a separation, for instance, or if our allocation went down and it would be negatively impacted that way. So Those are two of the options that we use. You could also just plug in real costs, and those I don't have a spreadsheet for that because you don't really need one. You would just take something like these two columns and you would put in the actual costs of things and then manipulate those that didn't have an actual cost associated with it at that time. Again, you're going to want to plan for the CLNA, I'm sure. You'll also need to plan for the fact that we won't have a Perkins assessment grant in the new grant cycle. So you're going to want to build those expenses into your budget, and probably add it as an activity to your Perkins basic grant. This information really, some of that just applies to the first or the second year of the grant, depending. This is mostly second year information. Um, so if the CLNA is not applicable when you're watching this, you probably won't need to build those expenses into your first year grant. So what happens if a school corporation decides to separate and either form its own if they're above the federal threshold of $15,000 to be eligible to form a new CT district? And again, that's also part of Section 131 if you look at the full text I sent. Let's say that Deaton School City decides they want to break away to form their own school corporation, CT district. So they're going to become a separate one. They're going to be number 53 or something. They take with them the amount of their allocation by member corporation. So they take that amount with them. They would end up, if they were going to do it this year, they would take $41,000 by with them, and CT District 78 would lose $41,000. That's what happens when they separate. Now, if they join an existing consortium, that $41,000 goes to the existing consortium. So it just moves along with the school corporation. It doesn't become part of a CT district until we get that total. If you have more questions about separations or if you have concerns about that, please reach out to me and we can talk about some ways to maybe mitigate the circumstances around that, or just ways for you to plan for that eventuality. So these are the spreadsheets that I use, how raw data becomes an allocation for each of our recipients. And I personally find this fascinating and it's a very exciting part of my year. But it can be a little bit weedy if you're not used to seeing all of this data or you're not used to those calculations or formulas. But I think it does help to know how our Perkins allocations are determined at this level and how that can impact your budget. So again, you're looking at changes in your population. The 30% category doesn't have as big an impact as the 70%, obviously. But it is something to keep in mind that Perkins funding is variable. It does change from year to year. We always hope that people will experience increases, but that isn't always the case. Uh, and usually, when we do see a large change, something significant, a drop or an increase, I go in and I check the data again, and I'm to determine what the reason was. What am I going to say to the CT director when they call me and say, why is my allocation so much lower than it was the year before? I want to be able to tell you that, and let you know why. And it is usually because of the 70%. It might be because you had a separation, in which case you already are aware of that. I'm going to stop sharing, and I just want to reiterate that the information you saw in the spreadsheet, the dollar amounts are not real. They're preliminary, but the data itself is accurate. If you do have questions about any of the information presented today, please let me know. I would be happy to walk you through more specific aspects of each of the formulas or of the legislation or grant guidance. Thank you, and I hope you have a good day.